Welcome back to Human Emotion. Today we're going to address the question of, is our brain actually emotional? So is this part of our body that we think of as devoted almost exclusively to rational thinking, things like memory, attention, language, can it actually be something that, helps give rise to our everyday emotional experiences? And if so, are there certain parts of the brain that do so? And in what way do they give rise to the emotion? And which emotions? Does our brain help explain things like fear, desire, happiness? So these are some of the questions we're going to look at today as we try to delve into this question of, is our brain actually emotional? And this will be the first of a three-part series, delving into the field of emotion and the brain, which is referred to the field of affective neuroscience. And so today will be our introduction to affective neuroscience, where we really begin to try to answer this question of, is our brain emotional? And we'll do so by going through the following roadmap. We'll start with some tools that researchers use to try to study the emotional brain, followed by some initial kind of first insights that researchers had when they were discovering the ways in which our brain really corresponded with the kinds of subjective feelings people reported having, both positive and negative. And we'll conclude with our takeaway questions and a very exciting expert interview with the sort of founder of this field of affective neuroscience. So let's start first with some of the tools that people use to try to study the emotional brain. So, can the brain tell us something about emotion? So here, what I want to try to argue with you is, yes, it can, and here's how it can do so. So first, the brain can tell us something about emotion by helping us identify what are called potential biomarkers of emotion. So in other words, tell us something about what are the brain regions that are associated with emotion experiences. Second, it also can help us examine the kind of interrelationships between different neural or brain regions to understand how the brain tries to regulate emotions. When you have intense emotions, how does it try to rein them in or harness them? And third, the brain can also tell us something about emotion by helping inform psychological theories of emotion, its causes, its mechanisms, and its consequences. So the brain actually can tell us a great deal about emotion. If we think about these three main kind of big picture themes: biomarkers, interrelationships, and informing psychological theories. So how can it do this? So I'm going to walk you through a few different tools that have been used to study the emotional brain. So the first example you can see here refers to lesions. So you can have naturally occurring lesions, lesions being damages to particular areas of the brain. The kind of classic case that's been talked about is Phineas Gage. So Phineas Gage was a railroad worker in 1843 who accidentally had a railroad spike pass through the region of his brain referred to as the prefrontal cortex. So he's out there working on the railroad, and this kind of metal beam just, bam, went right through his skull and selectively damaged or lesioned this part of his brain. And although Phineas Gage survived, and he actually never even lost consciousness, he was never the same after. Even though he had sort of similar cognitive abilities, he had changed emotionally. People would say Gage was no longer Gage. And after the accident in particular, he became really aggressive, socially inappropriate, and irresponsible. So people thought, wow, maybe he had a lesion in part of his brain that may have been responsible for helping him kind of rein in his impulsive emotional tendencies. So lesions can tell us a lot about what parts of the brain help with different kinds of emotional functions. And if you're poor Phineas Gage here, we learned something about the orbital frontal cortex and how it helps us regulate emotions when it's damaged. There's also, as you can see here, areas of damage like having aneurysms or areas of disease such as in frontotemporal dementia, where different regions of the brain are being selectively degraded over time. And here we can also learn, by having an absence or damage in certain part of the brain, what kinds of emotion-related changes we see. So that's lesions. A second example is called TMS, or transcranial magnetic stimulation. So you can see this guy here sitting down innocently with his tie and having a strange looking device placed above his head. And you may wonder, well, what is that? So what this device is, a TMS device, is it creates a strong focal magnetic field over the scalp of just a healthy individual. And what this strong magnetic field is that's placed above the head actually causes a temporary disruption in the brain or neural activity. So you can kind of selectively turn on and turn off different parts of the brain. The pros here is that thankfully it's reversible. It's not like Phineas Gage where you have long-lasting changes. It's actually very brief. It's repeatable, and it's relatively non-invasive. At most, people report having minor headaches afterwards. Some of the limitations, though, is it's not clear where the disruption is located precisely. You sort of have this thing orbiting above your head, causing temporary disruption in neural activity, but it's hard to say exactly where that's happening, right? So it's not clear how it's working or what it's doing. Some of the work that's used TMS, though, was used by, in the 80s by Dr. Persinger, who stimulated people's temporal lobes with this weak magnetic field using TMS, and found that he could induce what he called the God helmet, so to speak, or he induced these states of religiosity and awe simply by sort of selectively using this device to create a strong magnetic field over the temporal lobe. So he found, or felt that he had found, that he could claim that there's a certain brain region associated with religiosity. Now, those may be some sort of grand claims, but what this particular tool does suggest is that it gives us some insight in non-invasively to try to turn on and turn off and stimulate different parts of the brain to just sort of see what kind of emotional or psychological changes happen. So that's a bit about TMS. One of the most common tools that's used to date to try to understand the function of emotion, as you can see here, is through functional neuroimaging. So here you have people lie on a scanner bed, they're sort of rolled into the scanner, and here what we're able to see is relative areas of the brain that seem to be more or less active when people are in the scanner watching different kinds of emotional stimuli. It could be images, it could be films, it could be memories, and you can ask yourself, well, what goes on in the brain when they're engaging in these emotional tasks versus engaging in relatively neutral or non-emotional tasks. And we'll talk about some specific examples of how fMRI has been used to try to study emotion. So when we think about neuroimaging a bit more here, what we see are sort of different aspects of neuroimaging. So I talked about one, which was fMRI, but there's several others. So the first you can see here is called computerized axial tomography, or a CAT scan. It's very similar to an X-ray, which may be something very familiar to many of you. You've broken an arm or maybe a leg. You've had maybe an X-ray done. So a CAT in many ways is almost like an X-ray of the brain. Though as you can see there, it's something that's less commonly used now. Instead, what people are using are things like positron emission tomography, or PET. So in PET scans, what they do is they inject a radioactive isotope and then measure kind of where it travels in the brain. And the idea is that perhaps where it travels most are the regions that are most active in a particular instance. There's also EEG, or electroencephalography. We talked a little bit about this earlier in the course, but essentially what you're doing is you're placing electrodes on the person's scalp, non-invasively, like little sensors, and you're able to measure the local electrical activity with the scalp electrodes. So sort of from the scalp, where do you see the most kind of electrical activity happening? And a lot of this work really looks at activity in different hemispheres, your left versus your right hemisphere, that we'll talk about in just a bit, insofar as each of these hemispheres has been differentially associated with either positive or negative emotion. And then finally, what we talked about originally is fMRI, so functional magnetic resonance imaging. So this, in many ways, is one of the most predominant tools used when people are talking about studying neuroimaging of emotion. So what fMRI does, broadly speaking, is measure the amount of oxygenated blood in a given brain area, with the underlying idea that the more metabolic activity you see in a given brain region should equate to greater blood activity, right? So what we're looking for, in a sense, is what areas of the brain are sort of consuming more oxygenated blood. And those areas of the brain, therefore, we're inferring, must be more active. right? And so we try to look at relative, what we call neural activity, or bold responding, as a way to understand which parts of the brain, quote, light up when people are engaging in different kinds of emotion tasks. And we'll go through some fun examples of the kinds of studies that have used fMRI. So we've talked about some tools that we can use to study emotion, and what I'd like to now do is segue into some initial scientific insights that have used these tools as a first pass into trying to understand the landscape of affective neuroscience. So we'll kind of start with where the field first began by looking into some initial insights. And so some of the first most exciting insights in the field of affective neuroscience came by studying emotion and asymmetric patterns between the left and right hemisphere using EEG. And again, we just talked about EEG, which was using these electrodes on the scalp to measure relative patterns of electrical activity in the brain. So what can we learn by simply sticking electrodes on someone's head and seeing where it's more or less active? Well, here, what people did is they found that, interestingly, when we saw relative activation in the left hemisphere, that seemed to be associated with people experiencing different kinds of positive or approach-oriented emotions. And that was a relative left brain bias compared to the right brain. So they showed relatively more kind of electrical activity in their left hemisphere relative to right. Some of you may think of the left brain as also being associated with different kinds of cognitive tasks, especially language-based tasks as well. But here, this was the first insight suggesting, well, it's not only related to cognitive functionings, but it's actually something that may underlie our very experience of positive emotions. So I have you think of a positive memory or watch a positive film, and what we're going to see is that the relative cortical activity in your left hemisphere is greater than your right. So then, what about negative emotion? Well, it's sort of the contrast here. So when people are thinking of negative memories or watching really negative, awful films, what you're seeing is greater relative activation in the right hemisphere relative to the left. So people have thought that in some ways it may be that the left, quote, side of the brain may subserve some more general positive kinds of emotion experiences, and the right side of the brain with more negative emotional experiences. The one exception to this, and it's a really interesting piece of this, is that anger, right? So we think of anger as a negative emotion, yet the way that it looks when it comes to EEG technology is a lot like positive emotion. So we see a greater sort of left brain bias. This has really caused researchers to kind of reconsider the nature of anger, because in many other ways it actually doesn't operate like negative emotions whatsoever. It's associated not only with EEG patterns that look like positive emotions, but also, as we talked about earlier in our lectures on psychophysiology, also shows kind of greater kind of autonomic nervous system patterns too, like positive emotions. So anger is a fun and mysterious emotion that we don't quite know how to map. But for the most part, again, the left brain with positive, right brain with negative. And the researcher that really pioneered this work is Dr. Richard Davidson from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, seen as sort of the founder of this field of affective neuroscience in many ways. His work, Richie Davidson, has also looked at how can we understand changes in emotion or promoting emotional well-being by using tools of neuroimaging. And one route that he's done this is by looking at what's called mindfulness meditation. So what he did here was he did an 8-week randomized controlled study in mindfulness meditation versus a waitlist control group. He enrolled healthy adults in this study, and what he actually found is that meditation produces robust biological changes in the brain, if you can believe that. And this was only over an 8-week period, so these were not, decades-long, practitioners in meditation. This was a short intervention. And specifically what he showed is that people who were enrolled in the mindfulness meditation group as compared to the waitlist group actually showed increases in left hemispheric activity using EEG methods. And we just saw that greater activity in the left hemisphere is associated with more positive feelings. So you can actually see profound changes in the brain associated with positive emotion, well-being, by doing something as short as an 8-week meditation intervention. So these are some really powerful tools that researchers have also begun to sort of push forward, which is how can we actually change the way the brain operates in terms of its emotional, profiles by engaging in different kinds of psychological interventions like mindfulness meditation. And many researchers now are continuing this tradition with a whole different range of psychotherapies to see not only are people reporting feeling better, but are we actually seeing sort of robust biological changes in the brain. So if you're interested in learning more about this, a recent book came out. Richard Davidson is one of the authors, along with Sharon Begley, called The Emotional Life of Your Brain: How Its Unique Patterns Affect the Way You Think, Feel, and Live, and How You Can Change Them. I would also highly recommend, if you're interested in these topics, to check out the Wisconsin Symposium on Emotion. So this was from a few years ago, where the focus was on neuroplasticity of emotion, psychopathology, and treatment. But I would suggest you check out the website. You can see here healthemotions.org/symposium. It's a wonderful annual convention with some of the most cutting-edge research in the field of affective neuroscience, and the topics change from year to year. So just some readings and potential conferences you might check out if you'd like to learn more about this as we delve further into it in the course. So today we just touched on some of the tools, looked at some of the initial insights into studying emotion in the brain using EEG technologies and how that can tell us a bit about positive versus negative emotion, and how interventions like mindfulness meditation may change or shift our patterns of brain-based activity. And now we're going to transition to our takeaway questions for today. So our takeaway questions for our first segment on affective neuroscience, or answering the question, is the brain emotional, are as follows. So the first question asks, what are some insights studying the brain can provide for understanding emotion? Second, what are some of the major tools researchers use to study emotion and the brain? And finally, what do we know about hemispheric asymmetry and emotion? We talked about this in terms of positive versus negative emotion, and we also talked about it in terms of how we can shift these patterns as a result of engaging in different kinds of meditation, brief interventions. And today we'll conclude with our expert interview as part of the Experts in Emotion interview series. Today we have the special privilege of speaking with Dr. Richard Davidson. Dr. Davidson is the William James and Vilas Professor of Psychology and Psychiatry, Director of the Weissman Brain Imaging Lab, and the Lab for Affective Neuroscience. He's also the founder and chair of the Center for Investigating Healthy Minds and the Weissman Center at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Dr. Davidson received his PhD from Harvard in psychology and has been at the University of Wisconsin-Madison since 1984. He's published more than 290 articles, many chapters and reviews, and edited 14 books. He's the recent author of The Emotional Life of Your Brain and has received numerous awards, including an NIMH Research Scientist Award, the William James Fellow Award from the American Psychological Society, and the Distinguished Scientific Contribution Award from the American Psychological Association. Not surprisingly, he's been named one of the 100 most influential people in the world by Time magazine in 2006. He's the past president of the Society for Research in Psychopathology and of the Society for Psychophysiological Research. He currently serves on the Scientific Advisory Board at the Max Planck Institute for Human Cognitive and Brain Sciences, and as the chair of the psychology section of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. So I now turn to our very esteemed Experts in Emotion interview with Dr. Richard Davidson on affective neuroscience. Of, is our brain emotional? And we'll do so by going through the following roadmap. We'll start with some tools that researchers use to try to study the emotional brain, followed by some initial kind of first insights that researchers had when they we're discovering the ways in which our brain really corresponded with the kinds of subjective feelings people reported having, both positive and negative. And we'll conclude with our takeaway questions and a very exciting expert interview with the sort of founder of this. In other words, tell us something about what are the brain regions that are associated with emotion experiences. Second, it also can help us examine the kind of interrelationships between different neural or brain regions to understand how the brain tries to regulate emotions. When you have intense emotions, how does it try to rein them in or harness them? And third, the brain can also tell us something about emotion by helping inform psychological theory. Welcome back to Human Emotion. Today we're going to address the question of, is our brain actually emotional? So is this part of our body that we think of as devoted almost exclusively to rational thinking, things like memory, attention, language, can it actually be something that, helps give rise to our everyday emotional experiences? And if so, are there certain parts of the brain that do so? And in what way do they give rise to the emotion? And which field of affective neuroscience? So let's start first with some of the tools that people use to try to study the emotional brain. So, can the brain tell us something about emotion? So here, what I want to try to argue with you is yes, it can, and here's how it can do so. So first, the brain can tell us something about emotion by helping us identify what are called potential biomarkers of emotion. So in which emotions? Does our brain help explain things like fear, desire, happiness? So these are some of the questions we're going to look at today as we try to delve into this question of, is our brain actually emotional? And this will be the first of a three-part series delving into the field of emotion and the brain, which is referred to the field of affective neuroscience. And so today will be our introduction to affective neuroscience, where we really begin to try to answer this question.